The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III walked slowly toward the private dining room. His footsteps echoed in the vast hallway, each sound seeming to bounce off the golden frames of centuries-old portraits that watched over the royal family's daily routines. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the unusual quietness that had settled over the palace like a thick blanket, or maybe it was the strange tension he had noticed in the staff's behavior over the past few weeks. Charles adjusted his morning coat and paused at the heavy oak doors that led to the family's private quarters. Through the crack beneath the door, he could hear the soft clinking of china and the gentle murmur of conversation. His wife Camilla would be there, as she was every morning, reading the newspapers and sipping her tea while discussing the day's schedule with their personal secretary. But today, there was another voice mixed in with the familiar sounds, a voice that made his heart skip a beat in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had been staying at the palace more frequently lately. What had started as occasional visits to discuss royal duties and public appearances had somehow evolved into extended stays that seemed to stretch longer each time. William had been traveling extensively for his environmental initiatives, often leaving Catherine to manage their public responsibilities alone. Charles had noticed how naturally she had begun to fill the spaces that William's absence created, how effortlessly she moved through the palace corridors, as if they were her own home. As he pushed open the door, Charles was greeted by a scene that had become increasingly familiar, yet somehow felt different today. Catherine sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, her auburn hair catching the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. She was dressed simply in a cream-colored blouse and navy skirt, yet she seemed to radiate an elegance that filled the entire room. Across from her, Camilla was engaged in animated conversation about some charity event, but Charles noticed how Catherine's attention seemed to drift toward the window, her green eyes holding a distant, almost melancholy expression. The conversation stopped abruptly when Charles entered, and both women turned toward him with smiles that seemed just a fraction too bright, too carefully composed. Camilla immediately rose to greet him, as she had done every morning for years, but Charles found his gaze lingering on Catherine, who had remained seated, her fingers wrapped around her teacup as if seeking warmth from the delicate china. "Good morning, darling," Camilla said, moving toward him with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of royal protocol. "Catherine and I were just discussing the arrangements for next week's garden party. There are so many details to coordinate, and with William away, she's been absolutely invaluable in handling the guest arrangements." Charles nodded absently, his attention still drawn to Catherine, who had finally looked up from her teacup to meet his gaze. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the air itself was aware of some unspoken tension that crackled between them. It was Catherine who broke the spell, clearing her throat softly and reaching for a folder of papers that lay beside her plate. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying that precise, measured tone she used during formal occasions, yet somehow softer around the edges. "I wanted to review the guest list with you personally. There are several diplomatic considerations that require your direct approval, particularly regarding the seating arrangements for the ambassadors section." Charles moved closer to the table, ostensibly to review the documents Catherine had spread out, but finding himself drawn more by her presence than by any administrative necessity. As he leaned over her shoulder to examine the papers, he caught the subtle scent of her perfume, something light and floral that seemed to transport him away from the formal confines of royal duty to somewhere altogether more personal and intimate. Camilla, perhaps sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, busied herself with pouring fresh tea and rearranging the morning newspapers that lay scattered across her end of the table. Her movements had taken on a slight stiffness, a barely perceptible change in her usual fluid grace that suggested she too was aware of the undercurrents flowing through their morning routine. "These arrangements look perfectly adequate," Charles said finally, though he had barely glanced at the documents. His attention had been completely captured by the way Catherine's hand moved across the papers, her slender fingers pointing out various details with a precision that spoke of careful thought and thorough preparation. There was something mesmerizing about watching her work, about seeing the focused intensity that came over her features when she was deeply engaged in a task. Catherine looked up at him, their faces now only inches apart due to his proximity to the table. For a moment, neither moved, caught in a bubble of awareness that seemed to exist outside of time and place. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, her gaze searched his face with an openness that was both vulnerable and questioning, as if she were trying to read some message written in his expression. It was then that Charles became fully conscious of what had been building between them over these past weeks of increased contact. The formal boundaries that had always existed between them, the careful protocols that governed every interaction between members of the royal family, seemed to dissolve in that moment of shared recognition. He saw in her eyes the same awareness that he felt in his own heart, the same recognition of something that had grown beyond the bounds of duty and protocol. The sound of Camilla setting down her teacup with unusual force broke the spell, and both Charles and Catherine straightened, suddenly, very aware of where they were and who else was present. Camilla's expression remained carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had not missed the intensity of the moment that had just passed between her husband and Catherine. "I think perhaps we should postpone the detailed planning until this afternoon," Camilla said, her voice carrying a crispness that hadn't been there earlier. "Charles, didn't you have that meeting with the Prime Minister scheduled for 10 o'clock? You'll want to review the briefing materials before then." Charles glanced at his watch, realizing with some surprise that time had seemed to slow down during his interaction with Catherine. Indeed, he did have the meeting with the Prime Minister, an important discussion about upcoming state visits that required his full attention. Yet he found himself reluctant to leave the dining room, reluctant to break away from whatever was happening between himself and Catherine. "Of course," he said finally, stepping back from the table with visible reluctance. "Catherine, perhaps you could join me in the study later this afternoon? We should continue our discussion about the garden party arrangements when we have more time to focus on the details." Catherine nodded, her composure now fully restored, though her cheeks still held a slight flush that suggested she too had been affected by their brief moment of connection. "I would be happy to continue our planning session, Your Majesty. Shall we say 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock would be perfect," Charles replied, his voice carrying a warmth that went beyond simple scheduling arrangements. As Charles left the dining room, he could feel both women's eyes following his departure. The hallway outside seemed cooler after the charged atmosphere of the dining room, and he paused for a moment to collect his thoughts before heading to his study to prepare for the day's official duties. Behind him, he could hear the resumption of conversation between Camilla and Catherine, but the easy camaraderie that had characterized their earlier discussion seemed to have been replaced by something more formal, more careful. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like the shift in air pressure that precedes the storm. Charles made his way through the palace corridors with a sense of anticipation that he hadn't felt in years. The prospect of his afternoon meeting with Catherine had taken on significance that went far beyond simple event planning. He found himself thinking about the way she had looked at him, the openness in her expression, the sense of connection that had flowed between them despite the presence of his wife just a few feet away. The morning passed in a blur of official duties and ceremonial obligations. Charles met with the Prime Minister, reviewed correspondence from various Commonwealth nations, and participated in a video conference with palace staff about upcoming state functions. Yet through it all, his mind kept drifting back to those few moments in the dining room, to the feeling of standing close enough to Catherine to catch her scent, to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, to sense the warmth that seemed to radiate from her presence. By the time lunch arrived, Charles found that his appetite had all but disappeared, replaced by a nervous energy that made it difficult to sit still. He picked at his food while reviewing documents, but his concentration kept wandering to thoughts of his upcoming meeting with Catherine. What would they discuss beyond the garden party arrangements? Would she acknowledge what had passed between them that morning, or would they maintain the careful pretense that nothing had changed? As 3 o'clock approached, Charles found himself checking his appearance in the mirror more carefully than usual. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his hair, and wondered at his own behavior. He was the King of England, for heaven's sake, not some schoolboy preparing for his first date. Yet something about Catherine's presence had awakened feelings in him that he had thought long buried beneath layers of duty and protocol. The soft knock on his study door came precisely at 3, and Charles felt his pulse quicken as he called for Catherine to enter. She appeared in the doorway looking composed and professional, carrying the same folder of documents they had reviewed that morning. Yet as she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, Charles sensed the same underlying tension that had characterized their earlier encounter. "Your Majesty," she said, moving toward the chair across from his desk, "I've made some revisions to the guest list based on our earlier conversation. I think you'll find the new arrangements address all the diplomatic concerns we discussed." Charles gestured for her to take a seat, but instead of remaining behind his desk, he came around to sit in the chair beside her, ostensibly to better review the document she had prepared. In reality, he simply wanted to be closer to her, to recreate that sense of intimacy that had emerged so unexpectedly during their morning encounter. As Catherine spread the papers across the low table between their chairs, Charles found himself studying her profile, the delicate curve of her neck, the way her hair fell across her shoulder as she leaned forward to point out various details. She seemed completely absorbed in her work, yet he sensed an awareness in her posture that suggested she was as conscious of his proximity as he was of hers. "These changes look excellent," Charles said, though he was having difficulty focusing on the actual content of the documents. "Your attention to detail is remarkable, Catherine. William is very fortunate to have such a capable partner in his public duties." Catherine looked up at him at the mention of William's name, and Charles saw something flicker in her expression, something that might have been guilt or confusion or perhaps simple sadness. "William is very dedicated to his environmental work," she said carefully. "The causes he champions are important, and they require a great deal of his time and energy." There was something in her tone that suggested more than simple understanding of her husband's commitments. Charles heard a note of loneliness, perhaps a resignation. It occurred to him that Catherine's frequent presence at the palace might stem from more than simple duty. Perhaps she was seeking the companionship and connection that William's travels made difficult to maintain. "And what about your own needs, Catherine?" Charles found himself asking, the question emerging before he could consider its appropriateness. Duty is important, of course, but so is personal fulfillment, personal happiness. Catherine's hands stilled on the papers, and she looked up at him with an expression that was both surprised and somehow grateful, as if no one had asked her such a question in a very long time. "I try to find fulfillment in service," she said quietly. "The royal duties, the charitable work, the public appearances, they're meaningful, and I'm honored to contribute to something larger than myself." "That's a very diplomatic answer," Charles said gently, "but it's not what I asked. I asked about your happiness, Catherine, your personal contentment." The silence that followed his question seemed to stretch between them like a bridge, creating a space for honesty that transcended the usual boundaries of royal protocol. Catherine's gaze dropped to her hands, which were now clasped in her lap, and Charles saw the careful composure she always maintained begin to waver slightly. "Happiness is a luxury that people in our position can't always afford," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have obligations, expectations, responsibilities to fulfill. Personal desires must take second place to duty." Charles leaned closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice. "But surely there must be room for both," he said. "Duty and personal fulfillment don't have to be mutually exclusive. You have the right to be happy, Catherine, regardless of your position or your obligations." Catherine looked up at him then, and Charles saw tears gathering in her eyes, tears that she was fighting to control. "Do I?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, playing a role that was written for me before I was old enough to understand what it meant. The public appearances, the speeches, the constant scrutiny. Sometimes I wonder who I really am underneath it all." The raw honesty in her confession moved Charles deeply. Without thinking, he reached out and covered her hand with his own, a gesture of comfort that immediately sent a shock of electricity through both of them. Catherine's breath caught at the contact, and she looked down at their joined hands with an expression of wonder and confusion. "You are extraordinary," Charles said softly, his thumb moving gently across her knuckles. "Not because of your title or your position, but because of who you are as a person. Your kindness, your intelligence, your genuine care for others. These things shine through everything you do. Don't let duty eclipse the beautiful person you are, Catherine." Catherine's eyes filled with tears at his words, and she made no move to withdraw her hand from his gentle grasp. "I can't remember the last time someone spoke to me like that," she whispered. "Like I was a real person instead of just a symbol or a public figure." "You are real to me," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "More real than anything else in my world right now." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. Catherine's free hand came up to wipe away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts at control, and Charles felt an overwhelming urge to comfort her, to somehow ease the loneliness and confusion that seemed to weigh so heavily on her shoulders. The afternoon shadows had lengthened considerably by the time Charles and Catherine finally broke apart, both suddenly, aware that their private conversation had stretched far beyond its intended duration. The garden party documents lay forgotten on the table between them, overshadowed by the emotional territory they had unexpectedly explored together. Charles could see in Catherine's eyes the same mixture of confusion and awakening that he felt in his own heart, a recognition that something fundamental had shifted between them during those quiet moments of shared honesty. Catherine was the first to compose herself, gently withdrawing her hand from his and reaching for the scattered papers with movements that betrayed a slight tremor. "I should gather these documents," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotional intensity of their conversation. "The garden party arrangements still need to be finalized, and there are other matters requiring my attention before dinner." Charles watched her methodical movements, noting how she avoided meeting his gaze directly as she organized the papers into neat stacks. The careful distance she was creating between them felt both necessary and painful, like applying pressure to a wound that hadn't yet been properly examined. He wanted to reach out to her again, to continue the conversation that had revealed so much about her inner struggles, but he could sense her need to retreat, to process what had happened between them. "Of course," he said, rising from his chair and moving toward the window to give her space to collect herself. "Catherine, I want you to know that our conversation this afternoon will remain completely confidential. You can trust that your thoughts and feelings are safe with me." Catherine paused in her paper gathering and looked up at him with an expression of gratitude, mixed with something that might have been relief. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Your understanding means more to me than you know. It's rare to find someone who sees beyond the public facade to the person underneath." The formal title created a distance between them that felt artificial after their intimate conversation, yet Charles understood her need to re-establish boundaries. They were both walking a delicate line between personal connection and the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed their lives within the royal family. As Catherine prepared to leave, Charles found himself reluctant to see her go, knowing that once she stepped through the door, they would likely return to the careful formality that had previously characterized their interactions. "Catherine," he said as she reached the door, "I hope you'll feel comfortable coming to me if you ever need someone to talk to. Not as the king, but simply as someone who understands the unique pressures of our world." Catherine turned back toward him, her hand resting on the door handle, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure slipped to reveal the vulnerability they had shared. "I will remember that," she said softly. And Charles, the use of his given name sent a small thrill through him. "Thank you for reminding me that it's possible to be both dutiful and human at the same time." After Catherine left, Charles remained in his study for a long time, staring out the window at the palace gardens without really seeing them. His mind replayed every moment of their conversation, every gesture and expression that had revealed the depth of connection flowing between them. He found himself analyzing her words, searching for hidden meanings and implications that he wasn't sure he should be pursuing. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside drew his attention, and he recognized Camilla's distinctive gait approaching his study. Charles quickly moved away from the window and attempted to arrange his features into an expression of calm professionalism, though he suspected that his inner turmoil might be more apparent than he hoped. Camilla entered without knocking, a privilege of their long marriage, carrying a tea service that she set down on the same table where he and Catherine had shared their emotional conversation just minutes earlier. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, but Charles detected a tension in her bearing that suggested she was carefully controlling her own emotions. "I thought you might like some tea," she said, pouring 2 cups with practiced precision. "You missed your usual afternoon break, and dinner isn't for another 2 hours." Charles accepted the offered cup gratefully, realizing that he had indeed lost track of time during his extended conversation with Catherine. "Thank you, darling. I'm afraid the garden party planning took longer than expected." Catherine is very thorough in her approach to these events. Camilla settled into the chair that Catherine had recently vacated, and Charles couldn't help but notice the contrast between the two women, where Catherine brought an energy of barely contained emotion and spiritual searching. Camilla radiated a calm steadiness born of years of royal experience. Both were beautiful in their own ways, but they represented entirely different phases of his life and different aspects of his own character. "Catherine has indeed proven herself invaluable," Camilla said, her tone carefully neutral. "She has a natural talent for organization and a genuine concern for the success of our public functions. William should be proud of her contributions to the family's public duties." There was something in the way she emphasized William's name that suggested she was reminding Charles of Catherine's marital status, though her expression remained pleasant and conversational. Charles found himself studying his wife's face, wondering how much she had observed or intuited about his growing connection with Catherine. "Yes, William is fortunate," Charles agreed, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "Though I sometimes wonder if we ask too much of her, given how frequently William's environmental work takes him away from London." Camilla sipped her tea thoughtfully before responding. "Marriage within our family requires certain sacrifices and accommodations. We all learn to find fulfillment in duty when personal desires must be set aside for the greater good. Catherine will adjust, just as we all have." The weight of her words settled over Charles like a heavy blanket, reminding him of the complex web of obligations and expectations that governed every aspect of their lives. Yet even as he acknowledged the truth in what Camilla was saying, he found himself rebelling against the idea that Catherine should simply resign herself to loneliness and emotional isolation for the sake of duty. "Sometimes I wonder if we've lost sight of the human cost of these arrangements," Charles said carefully. "The institution is important, certainly, but not at the expense of individual happiness and emotional well-being." Camilla set down her teacup with a slight clink that seemed louder than necessary in the quiet room. "Charles, that's a dangerous line of thinking. We've all made choices and commitments that require us to prioritize duty over personal desires. The stability of a monarchy depends on everyone fulfilling their roles, regardless of temporary emotional complications." The phrase "temporary emotional complications" hung in the air between them, and Charles realized that Camilla was more aware of his feelings for Catherine than she had initially let on. Her words were a warning, gently delivered but unmistakably clear in their implications. "I understand the importance of duty," Charles replied, choosing his words with care. "But surely there must be room for compassion and human understanding within the framework of our obligations. Catherine deserves support and friendship, particularly when she's struggling with the pressures of her position." Camilla studied his face with the keen perception that came from decades of marriage and royal protocol. "Of course Catherine deserves support," she said slowly. "But We must be careful that our desire to help doesn't inadvertently create additional complications for everyone involved. Charles felt the conversation moving into territory that required extreme delicacy. He sensed that Camilla was giving him an opportunity to step back from whatever path he was beginning to explore with Catherine, to acknowledge the potential dangers before they moved beyond the point of safe return. "You're right, of course," he said finally, though the admission felt like swallowing glass. "We must always consider the broader implications of our actions." Camilla seemed to relax slightly at his words, as if she had been holding her breath while waiting for his response. "I'm glad you understand. Catherine is a lovely young woman, and she's facing real challenges as she adapts to her role. The best thing we can do is provide her with stability and consistency, not additional emotional complications." After Camilla left to prepare for dinner, Charles found himself alone with thoughts that seemed to chase each other in increasingly complex circles. He understood the wisdom in his wife's gentle warning, recognized the potential chaos that could result from pursuing his growing feelings for Catherine. Yet he couldn't simply dismiss the connection he had felt with her, the sense of recognition and understanding that had passed between them. The evening hours passed slowly as Charles went through the motions of royal routine. He attended a formal dinner with visiting dignitaries, participated in polite conversation about trade agreements and cultural exchanges, and fulfilled his ceremonial duties with the practiced ease of decades of experience. Yet throughout it all, his mind remained divided. Part of his attention focused on protocol, while another part replayed every moment of his afternoon conversation with Catherine. He noticed that Catherine was absent from the dinner, presumably taking her meal in her private quarters, and he found himself disappointed by her absence, even as he recognized that her decision to avoid public appearances that evening was probably wise given the emotional intensity of their recent interaction. Camilla performed her role as hostess with her usual grace and skill, engaging the foreign dignitaries in conversation that was both entertaining and diplomatically useful. Yet Charles occasionally caught her watching him with a thoughtful expression that suggested she was monitoring his emotional state throughout the evening. As the formal dinner concluded and the guests retired to their quarters, Charles found himself walking the palace corridors later than usual, reluctant to retire to his private chambers, where he would be alone with his conflicted thoughts. The palace at night had always been one of his favorite times, when the public spaces were empty and he could move through the historic halls without the weight of constant observation. It was during one of these late-night wanderings that he encountered Catherine in the corridor outside the portrait gallery, apparently unable to sleep as well. She was dressed in a simple robe over her nightgown, her hair loosely braided, and she looked younger and more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. "Your Majesty," she said with surprise, immediately straightening her posture despite the informal circumstances. "I apologize for my appearance. I couldn't sleep, and thought a walk might help clear my mind." "Please don't apologize," Charles said, struck by how natural and unguarded she looked without the careful styling that characterized her public appearances. "I often find these late-night walks helpful when my thoughts are unsettled. Perhaps we could walk together for a while, if you'd like the company." Catherine hesitated for a moment, clearly aware of the impropriety of wandering the palace corridors alone together in their night clothes, yet seeming to crave the companionship he offered. "That would be nice," she said finally. "I've been thinking about our conversation this afternoon, and I find myself with more questions than answers." They began walking slowly down the corridor, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting, passing beneath portraits of previous monarchs who seemed to watch their progress with ancient, knowing eyes. The intimacy of the setting, the lateness of the hour, and their informal attire created an atmosphere that felt removed from the usual protocols that governed their interactions. "What kind of questions?" Charles asked gently, genuinely curious about her inner process following their emotional conversation. Catherine was quiet for several moments, as if gathering courage to voice thoughts she had been reluctant to examine too closely. "I keep wondering if the choices I've made have been truly my own," she said finally. "Sometimes it feels like I've been carried along by expectations and circumstances rather than making deliberate decisions about the direction of my life." Charles felt a deep resonance with her words, recognizing in them a struggle he had faced throughout his own life within the royal family. "That's a feeling I understand very well," he said. "The weight of tradition and expectation can sometimes make it difficult to distinguish between duty and authentic personal choice." Catherine glanced at him sideways, seeming surprised by his admission. "Really? I would have thought that your position as king would give you more freedom to make your own decisions about your life and relationships." Charles gave a rueful laugh. "In many ways, becoming king has only increased the complexity of balancing personal desires with institutional obligations. Every choice has implications that extend far beyond my own happiness or fulfillment." They had reached the end of the corridor and turned into another wing of the palace, passing through areas that were familiar yet seemed different in the quiet darkness of the late evening. Catherine seemed to be processing his words, and Charles could sense her wrestling with thoughts and feelings that she was still trying to understand. "This afternoon," she said carefully, "when you asked about my happiness, it was the first time in a very long time that anyone had treated my emotional well-being as something that mattered independent of my royal duties. It was both wonderful and terrifying to be seen that way." Charles stopped walking and turned to face her fully, moved by the honest vulnerability in her confession. "Your happiness does matter, Catherine. You matter as a person, not just as a symbol or a dutiful member of the royal family. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Catherine's eyes filled with tears again, as they had that afternoon, and Charles felt the same overwhelming urge to comfort her, to somehow ease the pain and confusion that seemed to weigh so heavily on her spirit. Without fully conscious thought, he reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped her control. The contact sent electricity through both of them, and Catherine's breath caught audibly in the quiet corridor. For a moment, they stood frozen in a tableau of intimate connection, both aware that they were crossing lines that couldn't easily be uncrossed, yet neither able to step back from the intensity of what was flowing between them. "Charles," Catherine whispered, using his given name again with a familiarity that felt both natural and dangerous. "I don't understand what's happening between us, but I can't deny that I feel something I've never experienced before." Charles's hand lingered on her face, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone as he struggled with his own conflicted emotions. "I feel it too," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "And I don't know what to do about it, either." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge they weren't sure they should cross. Catherine's hand came up to cover his where it still rested against her face, and the gesture felt like both a blessing and a benediction, a moment of perfect understanding that transcended the complicated circumstances of their lives. In that moment, standing in the darkened corridor surrounded by centuries of royal history, Charles felt as if the weight of protocol and expectation had lifted from his shoulders, leaving him free to simply be a man responding to a woman who had touched something deep in his soul. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, offering possibilities that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. #Silence engulfs the palace. Third part, the moment of intimate connection between Charles and Catherine in the darkened corridor seemed to last an eternity, yet was broken all too soon by the distant sound of footsteps echoing from another part of the palace. Both of them immediately stepped back, the spell of their closeness shattered by the reminder that they existed within a world where privacy was rare and observation was constant. Catherine's hand fell away from his, and she wrapped her robe more tightly around herself, as if creating a physical barrier against the emotions that had just threatened to overwhelm them both. "We should return to our quarters," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor Charles could detect beneath her carefully controlled words. "It's late, and tomorrow will bring its own responsibilities." Charles nodded reluctantly, knowing she was right, yet feeling an acute sense of loss at the necessity of ending their conversation just when they had begun to explore the depth of connection between them. "Yes, of course. But, Catherine," he added as she began to turn away, "please know that nothing about tonight changes my offer to be someone you can talk to when you need understanding." Catherine paused and looked back at him over her shoulder, her expression unreadable in the dim lighting of the corridor. And nothing changes the fact that we both have obligations that must take precedence over personal feelings, she replied softly. No matter how strong those feelings might be. They parted ways at the junction of two corridors, each heading toward their respective quarters without looking back. Charles found that sleep eluded him for hours after their encounter, his mind replaying every word and gesture they had shared, analyzing the implications of what had passed between them, and struggling to reconcile his growing feelings for Catherine with the complex web of loyalty and duty that governed his life. When morning arrived, Charles approached the day's activities with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. He knew that Catherine would likely be present for the day's official functions, and he found himself both eager to see her and anxious about how they would navigate their interactions after the emotional intimacy they had shared. The first test came during the morning briefing in the blue drawing room, where senior staff gathered to review the day's schedule and discuss any pressing matters requiring royal attention. Catherine entered the room with her usual composure, dressed professionally in a navy suit that emphasized her role as a working member of the royal family. She greeted everyone present with polite warmth, but Charles noticed that her gaze lingered on him for just a fraction longer than protocol required, a subtle acknowledgement of their shared secret. Camilla arrived a few minutes later, and Charles observed the interaction between the two women with heightened awareness. Their greeting was cordial and professional, yet he detected a slight tension beneath the surface courtesy, as if both were carefully monitoring their words and expressions for any hint of the undercurrents that had begun to influence the palace dynamics. The morning's business proceeded routinely, with discussions of upcoming state visits, charitable commitments, and ceremonial obligations. Yet Charles found his attention repeatedly drawn to Catherine, noting the intelligent questions she asked, the thoughtful suggestions she offered, and the natural authority she displayed when discussing matters within her areas of expertise. At one point during the meeting, their eyes met across the room while the chief of staff was reviewing security arrangements for a public appearance. The contact lasted only a moment, but Charles felt the same electric connection that had characterized their previous encounters, a recognition that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to some deeper level of understanding. When the meeting concluded, Catherine remained behind to discuss some specific details with the event's coordinator while the other attendees dispersed to their various duties. Charles found himself lingering as well, ostensibly to review some documents, but actually hoping for an opportunity to speak with Catherine privately. As the event's coordinator finished her discussion with Catherine and left the room, Charles found himself alone with her once again. The blue drawing room, with its ornate furnishings and formal atmosphere, seemed an unlikely setting for personal conversation. Yet the moment they were alone, the careful distance they had maintained during the meeting began to dissolve. "Good morning," Catherine said formally, though her tone carried warmth that went beyond simple politeness. "I trust you slept well after our late evening walk." "Not particularly," Charles admitted with a rueful smile. "I found myself with rather a lot to think about." "And you?" Catherine's composure slipped slightly, revealing the same restless energy that had driven her to walk the palace corridors the night before. "Sleep was elusive," she said. "I kept thinking about what you said regarding the balance between duty and personal authenticity. It's a complex puzzle with no easy solutions." Charles moved closer to where she stood near the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Outside, gardeners were tending to the flower beds that would soon be showcased during the garden party they had been planning, their methodical work a stark contrast to the emotional complexity of the conversation developing inside. "Perhaps that's because we've been taught to see duty and personal fulfillment as opposing forces," Charles suggested. "What if they could be complementary instead? What if finding genuine happiness and connection actually enhanced our ability to serve others?" Catherine turned toward him, her expression thoughtful and slightly hopeful. "That's a beautiful idea in theory, but how does it work in practice? Our lives are so constrained by protocol and expectation. Even our most private moments are subject to scrutiny and judgment. Charles felt the truth of her words acutely, yet found himself unwilling to accept that they were doomed to emotional isolation for the sake of institutional stability. Perhaps the constraints are more flexible than we've been led to believe. Perhaps there are ways to honor our obligations while still leaving room for authentic human connection. As he spoke, Charles found himself moving even closer to Catherine, drawn by the openness in her expression and the sense that she was genuinely considering possibilities she had previously dismissed as impossible. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated her face, highlighting the intelligence in her eyes and the subtle signs of strain that spoke to the emotional toll of her position. "Charles," she said softly, using his given name again with a familiarity that sent warmth through his chest. "What are you suggesting? What kind of connection are you talking about?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both understood but neither had yet been willing to voice explicitly. Charles felt as if they were standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that his next words would either pull them back to safety or commit them to a path whose destination remained unclear. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside caused both of them to step apart quickly. Camilla appeared in the doorway, her expression pleasant but alert as she took in the scene of her husband and Catherine standing together near the windows. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Camilla said, her tone light, but carrying an undertone that suggested she had noticed the intimate quality of their proximity. "Charles, you needed in the throne room for the investiture rehearsal, and Catherine, the ladies' committee, is waiting for you in the white drawing room." Charles and Catherine both acknowledged their respective obligations with professional grace, though Charles noticed that Catherine avoided meeting his gaze directly as she gathered her materials and prepared to leave. The moment of potential revelation had been interrupted, leaving them both with unfinished business that would have to wait for another opportunity. The day proceeded with a series of formal obligations that kept Charles busy, but failed to distract him from thoughts of his evolving relationship with Catherine. During the investiture rehearsal, he found himself going through the ancient ceremonial motions while his mind wandered to their interrupted conversation and the question she had posed about the nature of the connection between them. The afternoon brought a garden party planning session that included both Catherine and Camilla, along with several staff members responsible for various aspects of the event. Charles observed the two women working together with professional efficiency, noting how naturally Catherine had assumed a leadership role in coordinating the complex logistics involved in hosting hundreds of guests. Yet beneath their collaborative exterior, Charles sensed the tension that had been building between them, a careful politeness that suggested both women were acutely aware of undercurrents that couldn't be openly acknowledged in a professional setting. Catherine's suggestions were thoughtful and well-informed, while Camilla's responses carried an edge of territorial protection that was subtle but unmistakable. As the planning session concluded, Charles made a decision that surprised even himself. "Catherine," he said as the staff members began filing out of the room, "I wonder if you might join me for a private review of the final arrangements. There are a few diplomatic considerations I'd like to discuss with you before we finalize the guest list." Camilla paused in her own departure preparations, clearly recognizing that the diplomatic considerations Charles mentioned could easily be handled through normal staff channels. "Perhaps I should stay as well," she suggested carefully. "My experience with these events might be helpful in resolving any remaining issues." Charles felt the weight of decision in that moment, aware that his response would signal his intentions regarding Catherine to his wife. He could accept Camilla's offer to stay, maintaining the safety of group dynamics while avoiding any appearance of impropriety. Or he could insist on private time with Catherine, acknowledging implicitly that their relationship had moved beyond simple professional collaboration. "That won't be necessary, darling," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "The matters I need to discuss with Catherine are quite specific, and I don't want to impose on your time unnecessarily. I know you have your own commitments this afternoon." Camilla's expression remained carefully neutral, but Charles saw the flash of understanding in her eyes. She was too experienced in royal politics to miss the significance of his choice to exclude her from the conversation, too intuitive about human relationships to misunderstand what his insistence on privacy might mean. "Of course," she said with practiced grace. "I do have several calls to return, and I'm sure Catherine is quite capable of handling any diplomatic concerns that arise." After Camilla left, closing the door behind her with what seemed like unusual deliberation, Charles and Catherine found themselves alone once again. The room felt different with Camilla's departure, as if her presence had been maintaining a certain level of formality that had now evaporated, leaving them free to acknowledge the personal dimension of their relationship. "There aren't really any additional diplomatic considerations, are there?" Catherine asked, settling back in her chair with a slight smile that suggested she had understood the pretext for their private meeting. "No," Charles admitted, moving to sit beside her rather than across from her as protocol would typically require. "I simply wanted to continue our conversation from this morning. Your question about the nature of connection has been on my mind all day." Catherine's expression grew serious as she studied his face, perhaps searching for clues about his intentions. "It's a dangerous conversation for us to have," she said quietly. "We both know that any personal relationship between us would have implications far beyond our own feelings." Charles nodded, acknowledging the truth of her concern while feeling compelled to pursue honesty despite the risks. "Perhaps it's precisely because the stakes are so high that we need to be completely honest about what's happening between us. Pretending that these feelings don't exist isn't making them disappear." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her hands as she appeared to wrestle with internal conflicts that Charles could only imagine. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes held a mixture of fear and hope that made his heart ache for her struggles. "I've never experienced anything like what I feel when I'm with you," she said in a voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear her clearly. "It's as if you see parts of me that I thought were completely hidden, parts of myself that I'd almost forgotten existed beneath all the royal duties and public obligations." Charles felt his chest tighten with emotion at her confession. "You've awakened something in me as well," he said, his own voice thick with feeling. "Something I thought had been buried so deeply under years of duty and compromise that it could never resurface. When I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be genuinely alive, genuinely myself." The admission seemed to release something in both of them, a recognition that they had moved beyond the point of denying the depth of their connection. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed to be tears of relief rather than sadness, as if finally acknowledging their feelings had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice carrying both vulnerability and trust. "How do we navigate feelings this strong within the constraints of our positions and obligations?" Charles reached out to take her hand, no longer concerned about the propriety of the gesture, but simply needing the physical connection to anchor the emotional intimacy they were sharing. "I don't have all the answers," he said honestly, "but I know that what's happening between us deserves to be honored rather than denied. We owe it to ourselves to explore where these feelings might lead." Catherine's fingers tightened around his, and Charles felt as if they were making some kind of pact, committing themselves to a path that would require courage and careful navigation, but that promised authentic connection in a world where such things were rare and precious. Outside the windows, the afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the palace gardens, and Charles realized that their private conversation had once again stretched beyond its intended duration. Yet this time, rather than feeling guilty about the time they had spent together, he felt a sense of rightness, as if they had finally begun to acknowledge something that had been building between them from their first meaningful interaction. #Silence engulfs the palace. Fourth part the evening of the garden party arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, and gentle breezes that seemed to bless the elaborate preparations that had consumed weeks of planning. The palace grounds had been transformed into an elegant outdoor reception venue, with carefully arranged tables, floral displays that showcased the finest of the royal gardens, and a guest list that represented the highest levels of diplomatic, cultural, and social significance. Charles found himself moving through the pre-event preparations with a heightened awareness of every detail, knowing that the success of the gathering would reflect not only on the palace staff, but particularly on Catherine, who had invested so much thought and energy into ensuring that every element met the highest standards. As he reviewed the final arrangements, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her accomplishments, mixed with anticipation about seeing her in the formal setting where her planning efforts would be publicly displayed. Catherine appeared in the reception area 20 minutes before the guests were scheduled to arrive, and Charles felt his breath catch as he saw her in her formal attire. She wore an elegant dress in a shade of deep emerald that complemented her eyes perfectly, her hair styled in a sophisticated arrangement that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. Yet it wasn't merely her physical appearance that struck him, but the confident bearing she displayed, the sense of belonging and authority that she had grown into during her time managing royal responsibilities. Camilla joined them shortly after, dressed in her own formal attire with the practiced elegance that came from years of experience at such events. Charles observed the interaction between the two women as they conducted final reviews of the guest arrangements, noting the professional courtesy that masked the underlying tension he had come to recognize in their recent encounters. "Everything looks absolutely perfect, Catherine," Camilla said as they surveyed the garden arrangements. "Your attention to detail has created exactly the right atmosphere for our guests. The diplomatic seating arrangements are particularly well thought out." Catherine accepted the compliment with gracious thanks, though Charles detected the slight reserve in her manner that suggested she was aware of the complex dynamics underlying their interactions. "The staff deserves most of the credit," she replied diplomatically. "Everyone has worked tremendously hard to ensure that today's event reflects well on the royal family." As the first guests began arriving, Charles fell into the familiar rhythm of formal reception duties, greeting dignitaries and their spouses with the practiced warmth that royal protocol demanded. Yet throughout the evening's social interactions, he found his attention repeatedly drawn to Catherine, observing how naturally she moved through the crowds of guests, engaging in conversation with diplomats' wives, ensuring that elderly attendees were comfortable, and coordinating with staff to address any issues that arose. The garden party unfolded with a smooth precision that marked a well-executed royal event. Conversations flowed easily among the diverse gathering of guests. The weather remained cooperative, and the elaborate refreshments were received with appreciation and compliments. Charles found himself in discussion with several Commonwealth ambassadors about trade relationships and cultural exchanges, yet part of his awareness remained focused on Catherine's movements through the gathering. It was during a momentary lull in his own conversations that Charles noticed Catherine standing alone near one of the ornate fountain displays, apparently taking a brief respite from her hostess duties. She seemed to be watching the guests with a thoughtful expression that suggested she was evaluating the success of the event while perhaps reflecting on her own role in creating the experience for others. Without fully conscious decision, Charles found himself moving in her direction, drawn by the opportunity for a private word amid the public gathering. As he approached, Catherine became aware of his presence and turned toward him with a smile that held both professional acknowledgement and personal warmth. "The event is a tremendous success," Charles said, positioning himself so that their conversation would appear casual to any observing guests. "Your planning has created exactly the right atmosphere for diplomatic and social engagement. You should be very proud of what you've accomplished." Catherine's smile deepened at his praise, and Charles noticed that the compliment seemed to mean more to her than simple professional recognition. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's gratifying to see everything come together as planned. Though I must admit, I'm looking forward to a quieter evening once our guests have departed." The mention of evening ahead sent a small thrill through Charles, suggesting as it did the possibility of private time together after their public obligations had been fulfilled. "Perhaps you'd join me for a quiet dinner afterward," he suggested, his voice low enough that nearby guests wouldn't overhear. "We could review the evening's successes and discuss future events that might benefit from your organizational talents." Catherine's eyes met his directly, and Charles saw in them the same awareness of underlying meaning that characterized their recent interactions. "I would like that very much," she replied, her words carrying implications that went far beyond simple scheduling arrangements. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of several Commonwealth officials who wished to discuss upcoming cultural exchanges, and Charles found himself drawn back into his formal hosting duties. Yet the brief exchange with Catherine had charged the remainder of the evening with anticipation, creating an undercurrent of personal connection that enhanced rather than distracted from his diplomatic obligations. As the afternoon stretched into evening and the formal garden party drew to a close, Charles managed the departure of guests with practiced efficiency while internally counting the minutes until he could transition from public duties to private time with Catherine. The elaborate cleanup process that followed such events would normally occupy his attention, but tonight he found himself eager to delegate those responsibilities to staff so that he could focus on the personal conversation that awaited. Catherine remained visible throughout the post-event activities, ensuring that valuable items were properly secured and that the garden arrangements were dismantled without damage to the permanent landscaping. Her continued attention to detail, even after the successful conclusion of the event, reinforced Charles's growing admiration for her dedication and competence. When the last of the cleanup had been completed and the palace grounds had been restored to their normal state, Charles sent word through staff channels that Catherine should join him in his private dining room for a review of the evening's events. The message was formally worded to maintain appropriate protocol, yet Charles hoped she would understand the personal invitation that lay beneath the professional language. Catherine arrived at the private dining room precisely at the appointed time, having changed from her formal garden party attire into a simpler but equally elegant dress that seemed to signal her own transition from public to private persona. Charles had arranged for a quiet dinner to be served, intimate enough to facilitate genuine conversation while maintaining the dignity appropriate to their positions. "Please sit wherever you're comfortable," Charles said as she entered, gesturing toward the smaller table he had chosen rather than the formal dining arrangement that would have emphasized the hierarchy between them. "I thought we might benefit from a more relaxed setting after the formality of this afternoon's event." Catherine chose a seat that allowed them to converse easily while maintaining enough distance to preserve propriety, though Charles noticed that she seemed more at ease than she had in their recent encounters. Perhaps the success of the garden party had given her confidence, or perhaps she had reached some internal resolution about the nature of their relationship. "The evening exceeded even my most optimistic expectations," Catherine said as they began their meal. "The feedback from guests was overwhelmingly positive, and I believe we've strengthened several important diplomatic relationships through the social connections that were made." Charles listened to her detailed analysis of the event's successes with genuine interest, impressed by her sophisticated understanding of the political and social dynamics that had played out during the afternoon. Yet as the evening progressed, he found himself increasingly focused on Catherine herself rather than on the professional matters they were ostensibly reviewing. "Catherine," he said finally, setting down his wine glass and meeting her gaze directly, "I want to tell you how much I've come to value not just your professional contributions, but your presence in my life. These past weeks of working together have meant more to me than I think you realize." Catherine's expression grew serious at his words, and Charles saw her carefully maintain composure begin to waver as she processed the implications of his statement. "Charles," she said softly, "I need to be honest with you about something. These feelings between us, this connection we've been exploring, it's become impossible for me to ignore or dismiss." Charles felt his heart rate accelerate at her admission, recognizing that they were finally approaching the conversation they had been circling around for weeks. "What are you saying?" he asked, though part of him already knew what she was going to reveal. Catherine took a deep breath before continuing, as if gathering courage for words that would change everything between them. "I'm saying that what started as professional collaboration has evolved into something much deeper and more complicated. When I'm with you, I feel more alive and authentic than I have in years. You see me as a complete person, not just as a royal obligation or a public symbol." The raw honesty in her confession moved Charles profoundly, confirming what he had hoped but hadn't dared to assume about her feelings. I feel exactly the same way, he said, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his own. Catherine, what we have together is rare and precious. I can't pretend anymore that it's simply professional courtesy or friendly support. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't withdraw her hand from his gentle grasp. But, Charles, what does this mean for us practically? We both have marriages, obligations, public roles that constrain our personal choices. How do we honor these feelings without destroying everything else in our lives? Charles felt the weight of her question acutely, recognizing that they had reached the point where abstract emotional connection had to confront practical reality. I don't have easy answers, he admitted, but I know that what we feel for each other deserves more than denial or suppression. Perhaps there are ways to create space for authentic connection within the framework of our existing obligations. As he spoke, Charles found himself moving around the table to sit beside Catherine, drawn by the need for physical closeness that matched their emotional intimacy. Catherine turned toward him, her face illuminated by the soft candlelight, and Charles felt as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of understanding and mutual recognition. I need you to know, Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper, that whatever happens between us, this connection we share has already changed me in fundamental ways. You've reminded me that it's possible to be both dutiful and genuinely alive, both responsible and authentically happy. Charles felt overwhelmed by the depth of gratitude and affection in her words. Without conscious thought, he reached out to cup her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall despite her efforts at control. You've transformed my life as well, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For the first time in years, I feel hope that genuine happiness and meaningful connection are possible within our world of obligations and expectations. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and charged with the electricity that had characterized their growing connection from the beginning. Charles felt as if they were standing at the threshold of something that could either fulfill their deepest longings or complicate their lives beyond repair. Catherine's hands came up to cover his where they still framed her face, and the gesture felt like both blessing and commitment, an acknowledgement that whatever came next, they would face it together with honesty and mutual support. Charles, she whispered, using his given name with a familiarity that now felt natural and right. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I know that this moment, this connection between us, is real and precious and worth whatever risks we might have to face. Charles felt his heart overflow with affection and gratitude for her courage in acknowledging their mutual feelings despite the complexity of their circumstances. Whatever challenges we encounter, he replied softly, we'll face them with honesty and care for each other's well-being. This connection between us is too valuable to sacrifice to fear or convention. As the evening light faded completely outside the dining room windows, Charles and Catherine sat together in the candlelight, hands intertwined, having finally acknowledged the depth of feeling that had been building between them for weeks. The silence that engulfed the palace around them was no longer empty, but full of possibility, pregnant with the potential for a connection that promised to transform both of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges and complications that would require careful navigation and mutual support. But in that moment, surrounded by the quiet dignity of the palace that had witnessed centuries of royal dramas and personal transformations, Charles and Catherine had found something rare and precious, authentic human connection that transcended the boundaries of duty and protocol to touch the deepest parts of their hearts and souls.